This presentation is on traditional oral language and storytelling in Alaska. Language in any culture is an important part of keeping track of history, teaching, and entertaining. It's important to one's identity and helps tie families and communities together. It helps people track their origins and brings unity to those who share dialects that make each group feel unique and yet a part of a whole. When languages are lost, so too is culture. This can create a sense of detachment from one's past and can make it difficult for people to know who they are, where they come from, and where they fit in. It can create a sense of guilt and shame and can cause pain and trauma that lasts for several generations. Many Native Alaskans know this trauma all too well and have suffered the ill effects of the loss of culture and language for far too long. In Alaska, there are two major language families. The Aleutian language is separated into Aleut and Eskimo, which is further divided into three Yupik languages and Inupiaq. These variances in language occurred several thousand years ago due to separation and isolation of groups. And as with any language, further separation of groups creates additional dialects from one group to the next. Each group shares stories, history, and teaching practices that are culturally important. Yet many of these languages and dialects have disappeared, and many more are in danger of doing the same, with only a few elders knowing and fluently using these languages today. The loss of these languages has been a personal blow to many Indigenous people because it also means the loss of culture, worldview, and identity, all of which were expressed through oral language and traditional stories. The loss of many Alaska Native languages occurred with the introduction of Russian fur traders, religious missionaries, and educational systems that discouraged Indigenous language and culture and insisted on the use of the more dominant English language. Many missionaries and educators even went so far as to insist that parents, families, and communities only speak English at home, making communication between children and others difficult or even impossible, and creating confusion and shame for everyone. Yet many of these groups have managed to hold on to traditional practices even in the face of opposition, thus maintaining their identity and culture. The traditional stories that are shared tie to the subsistence lifeways of many Alaskan natives that still are used to help them survive today. Some of these stories include how and when to hunt and gather, and past generational beliefs that people and animal and the land are all one. They teach respect and coexistence between animals, people, and the earth. And they also teach what possible outcomes there are, possibly negative, when respect is not given to these things that are there for them to use. Oral stories and the traditional ecological knowledge that is passed down from one generation to the next often yields very reliable data and helps the people in these regions know when and where to gather. And this knowledge is actually oftentimes more reliable than scientific data that is gathered. While modern scientists and Native Alaskans agree that global warming is changing the face of the planet, especially in the colder regions of the far north, they are often at odds with the way in which the world is affected. Science tends to separate the planet from people, while Indigenous stories tell of the connection between the earth and those who rely on her for survival. While science and oral stories tell the same story of the ebb and flow of glaciers, science relies on data from ice core, tree rings, lake sediment, and glacial deposits, whereas traditional ecological knowledge uses narrative to explain the same phenomena, using actors that help explain the same outcome. Interestingly, these narratives also play an important role in today's ecological debates about animal migration patterns and numbers. In a report written by Jesse Ford for the Oregon Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, he explains that the data recorded by science about the number of remaining bullhead whales, estimating some 2,000 to 3,000, is very different from the numbers observed by the Inuit hunters, who have a much better understanding of the migration patterns of these animals. Because science is limited to tracking migration patterns in traditional paths, and because these paths, or leads, tend to close as ice packs move, they can easily miss the fact that migration paths also move. These changes in migration patterns are more easily tracked by the Inuit hunters, who also change travel and hunting paths for the same reasons. As the indigenous people of the area who rely on subsistence share hunting stories, they're better able to track the movement of whales and have a better understanding of the actual number of animals that do exist in the area. This is not the only instance where science and indigenous residents have been at odds with the number of animals that are in an area. Again, it is the oral storytelling tradition from one hunting group to another that has helped set the record straight. In Burrow, Alaska, where the Inupiat residents rely heavily on polar bears for subsistence, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services have attempted to place these animals on the threatened list and have sought to limit the number of bears that the residents can hunt, or have even tried to stop them from hunting them altogether. A reporter, Cameron M. Smith, visited the burrow and listened firsthand to the oral stories of the people who live there, and walked away with a much better understanding of how the traditional ecological knowledge of the residents there is more reliable than the data gathered by science. These stories are not only important to traditional hunting practices, but they're also an important way in which these traditions are passed down from one generation to the next. Storytelling was and still is a very important way to teach younger generations how to survive in the same manner as those who've passed down this knowledge. With the introduction of Western education, oftentimes these storytelling practices were lost. Yet with educational reform, it's been very fortunate, because many of these educational practices have begun to incorporate traditional storytelling, and it gives natives the ability to it's given them the ability to distribute this knowledge to younger generations. In an attempt to revitalize traditional storytelling in indigenous populations, school intervention programs have begun to utilize these same storytelling practices in education. This means making storytelling less of a listening activity and more of a performance activity. Traditionally, understanding was measured in one's ability to perform a task that was related to the story being told, such as making a canoe, hunting, or gathering food. And these nonverbal displays of understanding yielded a much more holistic and less immediate response to the more effectively displayed understanding. Today, Native Alaskans are able to help children understand storytelling in a more hands-on approach, where they're actually going out and teaching children how to survive in a subsistence manner while telling these stories and using these stories for teaching and learning purposes. Unfortunately, at this time, many, if not most, Indigenous students are only speaking English. These languages have already begun to be lost, and the use of them has been gradually reduced to just a few elders who live in the community. And the loss of these languages has led to programs that are attempting to reintroduce them into the indigenous populations throughout Alaska. While communities are taking the lead, projects have been put in place to restore some of these lost languages. But there are those who believe that the right of these communities to decide if and how these languages should be preserved should be left up to the indigenous populations and the people themselves. And while educators grapple with language and cultural inclusion in the classroom, they have to be careful to respect the desires of those that they serve. They also have to respect that bilingualism does not only take place in a formal educational setting, but it also takes place in family homes, between generations, and in communities. While it's the job of the educator to recognize student identity, include these identities in the educational setting, they must also remember that these ties to language and tradition, including the tradition of oral storytelling, is not limited to the classroom. It's a part of the broader community that the student belongs to. And so the community and families should be an integral part of these storytelling practices. Storytelling traditions serve to teach one's history and place in the world. They pass down knowledge from one generation to the next as they teach traditional subsistence ways. They also help create a sense of pride in one's cultural identity and help preserve this identity for the next generation and for generations to come. These social and spiritual storytelling experiences help Native Alaskans make sense of the world around them and help them cope with the changes that have become a part of life. It creates a sense of unity among families and communities and teaches that there is no shame in accepting who one is and where they come from.